Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in the last day of the No Talks Frankfurt Book Fair edition with two topics that are very interesting. The first one is urban development and the second on volunteerism. This session will be fully in English, so we would like to remind our dear audience to choose their preferred language in the interpretation section at the bottom of the screen. Choose whether you would like to enjoy the session in French or Arabic. So hello, Nils. Nils, you're the head and founder at Urban Expert. And in today's session, we're going to delve further into urban sustainable development.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this interview with you.
And I would like to remind our dear audience that these sessions are brought to you by United Nations Development Program and the Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum Knowledge Foundation. So what makes this topic interesting and alarming at the same time is that we have seen that the global urban population is growing, and it is expected to exceed 60% by 2030. And we have seen, according to statistics by the United Nations and the World Health Organization, that 9 in 10 people they are living in urban areas worldwide were breathing air that did not meet the WHO air quality guidelines. So following these alarming signals, why should we care about sustainable urban development? What is urban sustainable development? And what is the ultimate goal of sustainable urban development? Could you walk us through the process?
Well, sustainable cities. I mean, I could give also like a technical answer, but I found out it's practically not really working. So for me, sustainable urban development or sustainable cities are in particular to make our cities a better place to live. What you said, we have problems with pollution and so on. Cities have challenges. So we really have to work on these challenges. And it's to improve the quality of life of the citizens and of the users of the city. So I think this is a key aspect of sustainable urban development in terms of all the dimension of sustainability. Often we just, for example, think about the environmental aspects, but it's about the environmental aspects, it's about the economic aspects, and it's in particular also about the social aspects. And all these three dimensions in a sustainable city have to be improved at the same time. So this, I think, is an important goal, but of course, this in compliance with their environmental capacities and limits which we have. So trying to apply sustainable urban development, for me, it's really, as I said, in every project and every activity you do to improve these different three dimensions. And for example, when you try to improve climate resilience in a quarter, or to try to adapt a quarter, which is, I would say, rather an environmental goal, it's always you should think about how can I use this project, this activity, for example, also to improve the social qualities and the economic opportunities. For example, how can I use the rehabilitation of buildings also for local businesses, so that also, let's say, the economy in the region is having a chance because of this change. Or when you adapt public space to climate change, you can also see how can I improve these spaces so that people meet there, that they have better spaces where they can meet and socialize. So I think it's always important in sustainable urban development to think in these three dimensions and to improve that with every project you work at.
I think, like you've highlighted, that it's not only about the environmental impact and the implications on citizens, it's also about the social and economic aspects. So what happens if our cities are left to grow organically, and which groups or countries or regions would be most vulnerable to urban poverty, if you want?
And for me, first of all, to let something grow organically sounds for me very positive. But we can see in practice with our cities, I mean, to let them organically grow means, for me, you're not interfering. And that means the market forces are making our cities. And we see many of our cities, maybe every city is not sustainable at the moment. So organically growing cities without interfering, I think, is not working. So I think we definitely have to interfere, because we have all the problems of, you mentioned pollution, we have urban poverty, we have social inequality, we have problem in housing, providing adequate and affordable housing. Also we have lack of infrastructure, lack of economic opportunity. So we can see in practice that we have larger challenges in our cities, which we have to interfere and to see how we can improve our cities. And I guess the reasons why our cities are not sustainable and why we have to interfere is our economic system, how it works, does not really go for sustainability, but it's also how we take decisions. It's not really, we often take our decisions quite short-term perspectives. Also, our personal needs are often not sustainable. So I think this all adds up why finally we do not really come at the moment to sustainable cities. And that's why we have to work on many different aspects to really come in the long run to better places to live. And you asked which countries are more vulnerable to urban poverty. For me, first of all, urban poverty you find everywhere in the world. So you cannot say it's just these countries and the others not. But of course, the intensity of urban poverty differs. And I think you find more severe urban poverties in countries which are less developed. You find it in countries with larger income inequalities. I think there's also a reason. Also in countries where you have wars, civil wars, in countries which have less developed educational system. I think education is also really a key aspect. Corruption, also it's what you really have to deal with, and which finally leads to urban poverty. And I think there are different layers. It's not the single layer which leads to urban poverty, but when they match up, then you get more and more severe urban poverty. And so you have all these different aspects you have in mind to really improve and try to prevent urban poverty.
So you have mentioned the importance of a good governance system, the importance of economic policies and policy making. But what about the role of citizen engagement and the private sector? Mainly the private sector through their manufacturing and production.
I mean, as I said, there are many different problems, and normally I work for municipalities for the public hand, but the challenges are so large. The municipalities, the public hand alone cannot solve it. They need to join up to force with the private sector, with civil society, with citizens, to really come to solutions which serve the different needs which you find. And I think this is also governance or sustainable cities about, you have very different needs on a city. And important is to really understand the needs of the different stakeholders, and then you need to balance and to coordinate them. And coordinating this, you just can do with the people. You cannot do it for them.
But what is in urban sustainable development for the private sector? Isn't it costly for them? It would reduce profits from their perspective, at least.
Depending what they do, how they work. I mean, you have in the private sector businesses who work in the field of sustainability, and for them, definitely they would earn more, because then they get more opportunities. But of course, you have also players, you can take it in the housing sector, for example. In particular, when you take a look in the last decade, you could see that the prices for houses, for rents have increased heavily. And this really gives a big pressure for many people that they cannot afford really to pay the rents. So these economies, these housing states, which use housing more just for commodity and not putting the function of housing first, of course, for them, and they will have less economic opportunities, but still they will have economic opportunities. It's just that their economic system, they have to shift, but also in sustainable cities, you definitely will make your profit, and it works. It's just shifting which economies, let's say, are forerunners, and other economies which do not lead to sustainable cities, they might decrease. But this always happened when you take a look in the past. Economies come up, they vanish, and this way we have to change how the economy in our cities is working.
So what are the key principles then for sustainable urban development?
For me, there are three key principles for sustainable urban development. One, first of all, that it's process oriented. One is that you have to find local-based solutions, so it's a place-based approach. And a third principle for me is an integrated approach. And maybe can explain a little bit what's behind these three principles. Because in my understanding, a city is never finished, it's never perfect, and it never will be. You always have new needs, new challenges which come up, and framework conditions are changing. So you constantly have to work on the improvement, on the quality of life in your city. So the process orientation means you have to monitor needs, you have to monitor the challenges, and based on these findings, you have to develop a strategy for your city. So to define where you would like to come to. It's like when you go in a car, you never just drive somewhere, you know where you go. So it's really about to build up then your strategy, to implement the actions and the goals which you define. And you also have to find out with whom do I have to work together, who are the stakeholders. So you have to implement, and after a while check again. Do we achieve our goals? Do we come closer or not? And then you start again the cycle, and a continuous improvement cycle. So this is an important part for me of sustainable cities, that continuously they try to improve. And
it's an iterative approach, right?
Yeah. In a way, it's a management approach. I mean, this comes out from management. So also in urban development, you can learn a lot from the private sector. So it's about methods. And the place-based approach for me, it's important because always the resources you have differ from city to city, from country to country. Legislation, tools which you have, needs differ. So you cannot just see, oh, other cities or other countries, they do that. No, well, let's do the same. No, you really have to say what are our local needs, and based on this, you have to develop your strategy. And also, when you know about a good practice, often you cannot just copy it. You really have to see, how can I adapt it and transfer so that it really works in my place and really corresponds to what I need. And I think this is another important part of sustainable development, to really have this local look, but also, of course, learning from other. And the integrated approach for me, in our world, I mean, we get educated as an economist or as a sociologist. So we have always this, I would say, this tunnel view. And so also when you take a look in public administration, it's divided into sectors. But I think if you would like to have a sustainable city, you have to have a more holistic view and really working on a subject from the different perspectives. The perspective of environment, of social aspects, the different dimensions which I mentioned. So this means you have to learn to break up these silos and work together within these different sectors. So this is an important part of the integrated approach, really to cooperate cross-sectorally, and governance is also a part of it, not just cross-sectoral, also with all the different players, private sector, civil society, and so on.
So reflecting on what you've mentioned now, then it's not costly to build a sustainable city. What it takes is an integrated approach, working together collaboratively, and then ensuring economies of scale, right?
Of course, you need funding for sustainable cities, because there are also technical solutions which are cost intensive, but also there are lots of possibilities and approaches which are not cost intensive. So that's what I say with a local based approach. Maybe a country or a city which has more funding, they will find other solutions because they have the fundings, but also cities which have less funding, still they can act and improve. So, and they will find different approaches which are less cost intensive. So it's not only about funding, it's really much more about changing how we work. So applying away these three principles, which are more methods related. And if we make this mind shift, I definitely think we come to more sustainable solutions, which will help us in the development of our cities.
So before moving into the approaches, I would like to remind our audience that they could drop their questions in the Q&A tab, be it in English, French, Arabic, and we'll make sure to convey it with our speaker. So Nils, you've mentioned the approaches, that some of them are cost intensive, others are not. So just coping with the technological advancements, what are some transformative, if you want, that are innovative or collaborative approaches that could be adopted and applied to advance the urban sustainable development forward?
Well, it's hard for me to highlight a particular transformative approach. I think if you would already apply these principles, I think then already that will be something really innovative and will be a large transformation. But also applying this principle, I know from practice speaking, it's very demanding. It's definitely not easy. But maybe I can pick two examples, maybe what can be transformative approaches or can help to transform our cities. And I think it's important to take it from two sides. We definitely need top-down approaches, but we also need bottom-up approach. It's really both we need. And maybe I can give two examples of a bottom-up or of a top-down approach where you can see this does transform and really helps us to get more sustainable. There's a very interesting NGO, which is called Critical Concrete in Portugal. And they're based in Porto. And they try to promote sustainable practices in the housing sector. And so they try to challenge the regular dynamism in the real estate development, and they want to promote sustainable architecture. So it's a small NGO with little resources, but what they do, they research first of all on natural and sustainable construction materials, but they're not only researching, then they apply it, they use it, and then they apply it in renovating social housing units. So they try to find more, let's say, environmental solutions, and then they apply it in the social housing sector. But they do not continue there. Then they say, okay, we can do this, we can renovate one house, two houses, but it's not scaling up. So what they organize every year, they organize summer schools. So they invite students from all over the world to come to their summer school, and then they try and teach them in these research or in their knowledge what they have about sustainable architecture. But again, they don't stop. They not just say, learn, and when you go and start to working, then you can apply this knowledge. Then they use at that moment when they're all there to apply these techniques. So they start renovating a house for families in needs. So again, they improve the social situation then in the city where the summer school takes place.
So you have introduced a new actor here, the civil society, the role of civil society.
Exactly. And this is what I would say. Bottom up means it's civil society, it's also the private sector. They all have to start acting, and they can promote sustainable development practices in our city. So we definitely need this.
But just before moving to the second approach, but who should lead here?
Who should lead them?
Yeah, who should lead in this agenda? Mm-hmm. Like you've mentioned civil society, we have several actors, the government, the private sector, citizen engagement, among others, but who should lead?
And then I think it's not about leading, it's about cooperation and co-creation. For example, when I work with municipalities, I tell them, okay, you say, oh, I cannot do this, I don't have the resource. Then I say, look for your partners. And then look who is in civil society, who is in citizens who might want to become active, who is in the private sector and who has also similar ideas. And this really means you have to join up, and it's really about cooperation, co-working together. And this is what has to happen, really working together.
And this would take us back to the title of this session, is joining forces and not leading and having just because, we have a perception that government is responsible for our cities. It's not true. I think you do agree on that. We are collectively.
They have a large responsibility,
yes,
but they cannot do it alone. They have to cooperate with all these different stakeholders, and first then they really will they can have a larger impact. So for me, it's a key at that.
So the second approach?
The second approach is for me then, let's say, a rather top-down approach. And there I would like to mention at the European Union, they have lots of funding programs, but they have two funding programs which really try to drive sustainable urban development. And I guess similar programs you might find in other continents or at national level as well. So one program is called Urban Innovative Action. It recently has changed its name to European Urban Initiative. And what they make calls for municipalities with a particular topic on sustainable urban development, and then cities can apply with set up projects where they try to implement a new approach, a new innovative approach, how to deal with a particular topic in their city, and to test it, and with the experience of this testing to scale it up. So before you put lots of money you invest, you first try out. So this program really through this program, they push cities to think in new ways, to build up partnerships at the local level, and then to test something new. And based on this experience, then to scale it up. Another project or EU program is UrbAct, which is about also sustainable urban development. And this is different. Here, it's more about they support cities to develop strategies, action plans, but it's not just they only get the funding when they match up with other cities. So they have to build up a network of cities which work together on a shared problem, but all they have to develop their local-based solutions. And another requirement of this project is they have to develop this in a participative approach. So in a way, they force these cities to start to think in this governance process, and they get then also support in this. So these are two programs which then try to incite cities to do things differently as they normally do, to apply these sustainable principles. And I think this is also very important because this pushes cities through funding and to do things differently.
And then how could cities like, you spoke about the European Union and several countries in the EU, but how could cities learn and support each other in this journey? Is it dual? Can a country in Europe support a country in Africa or in Asia? Is it possible?
It is definitely. I think we can learn from each other, and Europe can learn from Africa as Africa can learn from Europe. Like this is
but not replication. This is what you've mentioned at the beginning.
Exactly.
But how can we support each other? How can you support the agenda of another country, of another city, let's say?
Yeah. And for me, these networks are important. For example, in this UrbAct program, you have also transfer networks, where you have then, let's say, one leading city which has a good practice. And then the task of this network is to support each other and transferring and adapting this solution to the other cities. And what is interesting, because I was involved in I was involved in transfer networks, is to see that sometimes the good practice gets changed so much that it really comes a new solution in another city. And the good practice city is learning suddenly, oh yeah, this is how I can improve. They get also, so it's not just that they're teaching the other learning, finally everybody is learning. And I think really bringing different cities together helps this learning process. And what also interesting, you find out, sometimes you feel alone with your problem. And when you realize other cities also are struggling, but when you look jointly for a solution, you get quite positive energy. You see, oh, and then you find a solution that says, oh yeah, I will try this as well. So you get this positive energy. You need this positive energy to drive change. And so through programs which support that cities match up and support each other in developing solutions and learning from each other, this is, I think, an important key.
But do you think like the challenges when it comes to urban cities and sustainable urban cities are collective problems?
And this, I think, is important, that when you do these kind of networks, that they should be really thematic related. So it's not that you say it's about sustainable urban development. This would be too large. It's important that you really try to focus on a particular challenge or a particular problem. And then you look for cities who are equally, for them it's important, and they work then on a topic. And by this, then of course they have not just, also again, not too tunnely. They have to check if this problem how does it relate to, let's say, other problems, and by this get a more holistic approach. But you have to start on something quite concrete in terms of problems.
And this is super interesting approach, like a thematic networking. It's not networking for a very, if you want, general goal, and then would take us to a holistic approach and so on. So you've mentioned before the importance of governance and transparency and so on. So how does a good governance and capacity building promote sustainable urban development? And again, how could citizens accelerate the work? Not just their engagement, but how they could accelerate the work.
Maybe I start with the last part of the question with, can citizens accelerate, let's say, sustainable cities? Honestly, I doubt it a bit. I mean, I'm completely in favor of participation process, and I doubt it in this way because many of us in our personal lifestyles, we are not sustainable. And if I ask you, are you willing to leave your car now and don't use the car anymore? No. I think most people will say no. But I think involving citizens can help people who would like to change lifestyles in a more sustainable way. Through participation, you can give them the opportunity to interfere positively, to bring up their ideas. So for me, the participation of citizens, it's in particular about to provide the people who would like to change for the better, to provide them this opportunity to match up.
Shouldn't government impose some regulations? Like, okay, you've mentioned you don't want to leave your car, but then if you do impose some taxes, if you do afford the good public transportation. So we're saying that if all the sustainable urban component are there, and then you would use, you wouldn't act in a responsible or sustainable manner, then you should pay for that. Is this a good approach?
Partly it does. Yeah, saying behaving unsustainable might be then more cost intensive, and this extra money you get, then this you can use to ensure, for example, good public transportation. So in this way, yeah, you can do this. Of course, there's also a certain limit. If it finally comes when you do everything through the price, and then suddenly you get more social inequalities, then also you have to check. So there's a balance, and that's what I say. This is the hard thing of sustainability, to balance well these different dimensions. So maybe what sounds to be a good economic solution might just shift this solution, makes a larger problem maybe in the social sphere, and there you have to balance. So this you always have to have in mind. But in generally speaking, I think as our behavior is also, not only, but also, let's say, driven by money, this can be one tool which you can implement, like economical tools, and by this to try to have a behavior change. Yeah. But there are also limits to that.
Great. Then I think maybe there are some topics that are now very there's a huge hype around them, like inflation, housing, and so on. So I would just pick three subtopics, and then maybe you could tell me how do they relate to urban development and how they could support the sustainable journey. Let's start with affordable housing in light of inflation and the rising cost of living. How does this affect the progress towards a sustainable urban development?
For me in particular, well, maybe now it's a more Eurocentric view because they are more known about what is happening than maybe in other parts of the world. But when you take a look in the last decades, how the housing sector has developed, prices for buying and for renting have, I would even say in many cities, exploded. And to my mind, this has very negative effects in many cities, because when housing gets more expensive, let's say from your income before, you paid like 30% of your income for housing. If it doubled suddenly, because income has not raised as fast as what happens with rents and buying in the housing sector. If you, for example, have suddenly to pay like 60% of your income, then you have less money for the rest of what you might need to spend for education, or spending it for going out. So other economic sectors in the city have then more problems because they have less income, because people spend less in the other sectors. So for me, this provides not only social problems in terms of inequality, in terms of segregation, which you have a result of because of this development. It also provides economic problems for other sectors in the city. And most often the owners of these houses often do not live in the city. So the money goes out, goes somewhere else. So it's really then gone out of the city. So I think we definitely need a different housing sector, how it's run, how it works, as it's done at the moment. And I think we have in the past also cities or the government has been much more being responsible for providing social housing, which most of the cities have reduced the activities in the last decades. And I think, again, here cities are in charge to provide adequate and affordable housing. And I think if they could ensure that 1/3 of the housing market they would run, would be fine. The other third I would call, we have also lots of organizations in the private sector and the civil society, which also provide adequate, affordable housing. So if they could run in another third, would be fine. And the rest, the other third, this then the housing developers can develop as they would like to. I think if we have this division, 1/3, 1/3, then I think we would have a better housing sector as at the moment.
Yes, as we are discussing this topic, I think I would like to thank the audience for their engagement and interaction. We have a set of questions, so I'll just pick them up in a few and just keep them coming, guys. So what about demographic change?
demographic change also is very different when we talk about demographic change in Europe or North America, or when we talk in Asia or Africa. In North America and Europe, we have more the problem of a diminishing native population. So it's getting fewer people. We get much older. We have a much older generation. When you take a look in Asia and Africa, it's the other way around. You have much younger, so the younger population is increasing. And these very different developments also, of course, cities have to deal very differently with it. For example, when you have more younger population, which often then drives to move to cities, the public services have to adapt to it. So if younger people move to it, they need education. So you have to provide education, and not only through the private sector, because often this becomes too expensive to provide good quality. So you need also in the private and the public sector, good education system for these younger people. The younger people need jobs, so the cities have to provide job opportunities. Younger people often do not have like higher incomes, so they need affordable housing. And all this partly has to be provided by the public sector. So this puts really pressure on public services in cities. When you go then more to Europe or to North America, where it's more about elderly people, this puts a different pressure on cities, because you have to ensure that elderly people can live as long as possible independently in these cities. So they have to be kept mobile. So they have to be able to move in their buildings, in the surroundings. So it's much about deconstructing the physical barriers, but it's also ensuring the social security systems which you need, the health system you have to adapt to the needs of these elderly people. So different tasks, I would say, on cities, because it's a different issue of demographic change.
Maybe a third term would be a circular economy. It's not a challenge, maybe it's an opportunity, but how could circular economy support the sustainable urban cities agenda?
Yeah, I think so. The circular economy is the newest topic, I would say, in urban development. It's, as you said, it's not a problem. It should be a solution, a tool to improve or to become a sustainable city. And the circular economy, yeah, it's really changing how we do economy in our cities, because it's finally it's about not producing waste. So it's really about the circular economy. I think they really focus on buildings, how we do work with buildings. It's about mobility, and it's also about production. So when you take the example in the housing sector, we build, we tear it down, we dumped all the materials mostly, and then we reconstruct with new materials. And the circular economy is about, okay, we only construct in a way that we can reuse easily these materials, or that they can be easily repaired. So if we think we have to change a building, then we really can take these materials and reuse them, and we don't need to dump them. And of course, this really means you have to handle the whole construction of buildings very differently, and you have to use different materials as we might use it as we use it now. And this is the same in the production sector. Always when we produce something, at the moment we use lots of plastic. What we do afterwards, we throw it away, but we partly recycle it. But now let's think about different kind of products, which then we apply in our products, which we then also can easily reuse or even easily recycle to make new products out of it. Or also, circular economy is about less owning, it's more about sharing. So instead of we own everything with we need more materials, is we share the car with many people. So then we need less cars, less products, which also challenge, of course, our economy, how it works, because our economy works, we have to produce more and consume more and more. And yeah, also the economy, how it runs, needs in this way shift to be more sustainable, and that is a great challenge.
Yeah, and yesterday in the session we have discussed like the shift from a shareholder to a stakeholder perspective, and this would maybe also feed the circular economy and the benefits of sharing, and not just producing for the sake of profits at the expense of the environment. Nils, I don't think we can speak about cities without tapping on cultural heritage. How can we safeguard cultural heritage, which could provide social, economic, and ecological returns? And what are the returns?
when I started to work, I had nothing to do with culture heritage. And then it came that I lived outside of Europe, and I lived in Americas, in the north and the south. And then I saw these shiny city centers with high-rise buildings, lots of offices. But honestly, I never felt really home in these city centers. When I came back to Europe and I traveled, and then I saw these historic cities or older cities, I felt better. I felt more human scale, and I realized that these old structures, which might be old, but honestly, they serve very good our human needs, and you can also adapt them. So for me, cultural heritage is really, it helps us to provide identity, which we need. We need to feel home, and this part is identity. And cultural heritage often for me are cities and structures which are more human scale, and also it helps, or they are also more multifunctional. So you still have more function in these historic centers where you have housing, but where you have also offices, where you, but also you can buy. It's the city of the short way, what you sometimes say. So I think it's important to keep this structure because it makes us, I would say, feel better, but of course also you have to adapt it to further needs. So we cannot just preserve it and then leave it like it is. You also have to adapt it, but carefully. And I think the return which you get is keeping cultural heritage and rehabilitating it. It's part of the circular economy. Yeah. And it might be more labor intensive, but labor intensive means it provides jobs. So it also provides jobs, different jobs maybe than in the construction sector when you build new, but it's skilled labor what you need. And this also, I think it's important to keep, but also you see businesses also strive to be different. And being in a building which is looking different than the other ones also provides you like something special, and can also attract other people and say, oh, I definitely would like to work there. It's a different feeling of working. So also economic speaking, it really can give a return also in tourism, which can be an important aspect. Socially, as I said, for me, the identity is a good return of culture heritage, of also local pride. And from the environmental aspect is keeping, not demolishing, is part of, reusing the gray energy, how it's called. So instead of using new materials, you keep on using the materials which exist, you repair it. And this is also a big environmental benefit.
Great. I think we need to move to the questions for some questions from the audience. The first question relates that do you think that developing countries have the same opportunity to shift to sustainable cities compared to developed countries? Isn't this creating some disparities and inequalities?
I mean, I said in the very beginning, sustainable development is about improving quality of life. And of course, when you see how, well, I think in the developed countries, we have a high standard of quality of life, but it's also quality of life which is not sustainable. So in this way, I would say the developed countries have to learn to develop more sustainable lifestyles. In this way, we might have to reduce, which not means that we have to reduce quality of life, but it's a different quality of life we have to strive for. And for the developing countries is, they have to develop a different model of quality of life, and not just copy what we did, because what we did was not sustainable and was not good. And of course, here comes, it's a struggle. How far are they allowed to do the same mistakes, let's say, as we did? Or what I would hope for, that whether they develop a different kind of lifestyles, of quality of life, and which is from the very beginning more sustainable, and then we can learn from that. So the North, let's say the Northern Hemisphere, has to change how we work, how we do, and hopefully then the South finds a new model which is better, more sustainable than it was in the past. And on this we can work together.
And then we've been discussing urban development for the past 40 minutes, I guess. What about rural development? Shouldn't we emphasize and allocate equal opportunities and resources towards the improvement enhancement and development of rural areas?
Definitely, because a city can never survive without the rural areas. I mean, the whole food production, but also as you don't have so much leisure or green areas in the cities, you should try to have green areas and so on. But also you need the green areas which have more than the rural side. So in a way, city development also means regional development. So how can the region as one entity develop sustainably? I think this is important. And so you always need that rural areas survive, that you have also quality of life in rural areas. And this is a challenge to keep up the public services where fewer people live, but also you have to provide this. So rural areas are definitely needed to be able to have sustainable cities. So this has also developed in a connection, and you need a strategy how this both works together. So yeah, we need the rural areas.
And this would lead me to another question from the audience. Does urbanization fuel large-scale disparities and challenges in developing countries?
Again?
Yeah, does urbanization fuel large-scale disparities and challenges in developing countries?
Yeah, you have definitely these or maybe I don't get really correctly the question.
Yeah, I think they are saying like the increasing, the challenges that are brought by urbanization, would they fuel large, if you want, conflicts and challenges beyond the one that we know, like pollution, and environmental problems?
Yeah. I mean, in the scientific field, they try to find out what is the right scale of a city. Like we have these mega cities where it's really a so large problem. Is this really handleable? I mean, still it cannot really be said this is the right size of the city. But I think there's also a limit to the urbanization. I think this is what I definitely like in Germany. I mean, the largest city is Berlin and has 3.5 million of inhabitants, which in many other countries would nearly say so little. But because we have a quite decentralized system of cities, so you find cities everywhere, let's say in Germany, but not the real large ones. But I think this helps us to keep these cities more human scale and maybe makes it easier to make them sustainable as these large agglomeration, because then it gets nearly unhandleable. So I think there is a limit to urbanization in terms of scale of city size.
And one very last question: what are your thoughts on global indices and benchmarks that would classify cities as sustainable, inclusive? Are they inclusive?
I think benchmark, I mean, as competition makes sometimes people say, okay, I would like to become better. So in this way, benchmark helps. But it's always, you have to take a look behind what are the criteria behind the benchmarks. So for me, it's more in a way to incite cities to become more active, to become better. Benchmarks can help. But then again, the solutions which you have to find to improve, this you cannot find out through benchmark. For me, so benchmark are more like incentives and make people think about this topic. But then again, that's what you can achieve with benchmarks.
Great. And by that, we would reach the end of our session. Thank you so much, Nils, for this insightful and informative session. And we look forward to hosting additional sessions on this interesting topic.
Thank you much for the invitation.
Thanks. So our dear audience, stay tuned for our last session today at 3 p.m. Frankfurt time, Germany time indeed, which will tap on volunteerism from the United Nations Volunteer Organization perspective. See you.